It was minus 38 degrees, the kind of cold that freezes your eyelashes shut in seconds. The kind of cold that broke car engines, splits it without an axe, and turns exposed skin into a medical emergency within minutes. And this man was alone, no neighbors, no cell signal. No road back to town until spring thaw, just him, a patch of raw Alaskan wilderness, and a structure that looked like it had no business surviving a winter like this. But here's the thing that nobody talks about: that structure didn't just survive. It held 4 feet of snow on its roof without a single crack. It stayed warm through weeks of sub-zero nights. And it cost less to build than most people's used pickup trucks. This is a Quonset cabin. And right now, across the most remote corners of Alaska, men are quietly building these things and walking away from everything they thought shelter had to cost. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how they're doing it, why Alaska is the one place in America where this makes more sense than anywhere else, and what nobody in the building industry wants you to figure out on your own. Let's start with what this thing actually is, because most people get it completely wrong. When you look at a Quonset hut for the first time, your brain probably files it under storage shed and moves on. That's a mistake. These structures have a history that most people have never heard, and that history is exactly why they perform so well in the most brutal environments on Earth. The year was 1941. America had just entered World War II, and the military had a massive problem. They needed to house thousands of troops, equipment, and supplies in remote locations around the world. Fast. Locations with no infrastructure, no local contractors, no building supply stores within 100 miles. They needed a structure that could be shipped anywhere in the world as a flat kit, assembled by soldiers with no construction experience, and survive extreme weather conditions in places like the Pacific Islands, the Aleutian Islands of Alaska, and the deserts of North Africa. What they came up with was born at Quonset Point in Rhode Island, a semi-cylindrical arch made from corrugated steel, half a tube, essentially, with wooden end walls. The design was so simple that a team of men with basic tools could assemble a full structure in a matter of days. It was so strong that the arch shape distributed weight across the entire frame, meaning it could handle heavy snow loads that would crush a flat or even gently pitched roof. Over 150,000 of these structures were built during the war. They were used as hospitals, churches, machine shops, barracks, and cold weather survival shelters across the Aleutian chain, which is one of the harshest climates on the planet. After the war ended, surplus Quonset huts sold for almost nothing, and veterans who had lived in them overseas recognized something the civilian world hadn't figured out yet. These things worked. They weren't glamorous, but they worked in conditions where conventional buildings failed. 80 years later, the design hasn't changed in any meaningful way. And in Alaska, that's exactly the point. Here's what makes Alaska different from every other state in America when it comes to building a home. And this is the part that changes everything. In most of the continental United States, you cannot build a structure on land without first navigating a wall of bureaucracy. You need permits. You need inspections. You need licensed contractors for specific phases of the work. You need your structure to meet a long list of local, county, and state building codes. The process can take years before a single nail goes into the ground. Alaska is not most of the United States. The vast majority of Alaska's landmass is classified as unincorporated. That means it falls outside the jurisdiction of any borough with an active building code. There is no building inspector driving out to check your framing. There is no permit office to call. There is no licensed contractor requirement for a structure built on your own land for your own use. What this creates is an entirely different relationship between a man and his land. If you own property in these areas and you want to build a shelter, Alaska essentially says go ahead. Build what you need. Make it safe. That's between you and your conscience. Now here's where the Quonset kit comes in and why it fits the situation perfectly. Quonset kits are sold by manufacturers as pre-engineered structures. The steel arches are manufactured to specific engineering specifications. The load ratings, the snow load capacities, the wind resistance figures are all calculated before the kit ships. This matters because even in areas without building code enforcement, some buyers want documentation proving their structure can handle specific conditions. A pre-engineered kit gives you that paperwork without requiring a local architect or structural engineer to sign off on a custom design. You order the kit. It ships to the nearest freight depot. You haul it to your land. You build it yourself. No contractor. No permit in most areas. No inspector. No waiting. That gap between what's legally possible in Alaska and what most people assume is required to build a structure is exactly why men who have done their homework are moving fast on this. Let's talk about the build itself, because the process is more achievable than you probably think, and the details matter enormously. The foundation question comes first, and it's where Alaska throws its first curveball at conventional building wisdom. In much of Alaska, you cannot pour a traditional concrete slab foundation. The permafrost, the layer of permanently frozen ground that lies beneath the topsoil in much of the state, will leave a concrete slab over time as it freezes and thaws. What you build on top will shift, crack, and eventually become unlivable. The Quonset solves this problem in a way that conventional cabin builders spend tens of thousands of dollars trying to replicate. You build it on skids, heavy timber runners, typically 6x6 or 8x8 pressure-treated beams, laid directly on the ground or on surface pads. The structure sits on top of the skids, and because the whole system can flex slightly with ground movement, it doesn't fight the permafrost. It rides it. There's a secondary benefit to skids that most people don't think about until they're 2 years into remote Alaska land ownership. A structure built on skids is legally movable in most jurisdictions. It's classified differently than a permanent structure. That classification matters for property tax assessments, for land use regulations, and for the flexibility to relocate the building if your plans change. Once the skids are set and leveled, the steel arch assembly begins. The arches come in sections that bolt together. Each arch section is manageable for 2 men, though men have assembled smaller Quonset kits alone with the right rigging setup. The arches are spaced according to the kit specifications, typically every 4 feet, and purlins, the horizontal members that run the length of the structure, are bolted between the arches to create a rigid frame before the corrugated steel skin is attached. The steel skin is where the Quonset's legendary weather resistance comes from. Corrugated steel in the arch configuration sheds snow the way a dome sheds rain. There are no flat surfaces for accumulation, no valleys where ice dams can form, no joints where freeze-thaw cycles can work moisture into the structure. The arch carries the load down to the foundation in pure compression, which is the strongest way a structure can carry weight. A 20 by 30 foot kit, which gives you 600 square feet of usable interior space, can be shelled in by 2 men in a long weekend. A 20 by 40 kit pushing 800 square feet takes maybe 3 or 4 days. These are not theoretical estimates. Men who document their builds report these timelines consistently. The right approach is closed-cell spray foam applied directly to the inside of steel arches before any interior finish work begins. Closed-cell foam does 2 things that no other insulation does in this application. First, it creates a true vapor barrier between the cold steel and the warm interior air, which eliminates condensation at the source rather than trying to manage it after the fact. Second, it adds structural rigidity to the arch panels, which in a very large span actually improves the building's performance under heavy snow loads. A professional spray foam application for a 20 by 30 Quonset interior to a depth of 3 inches, which gives you approximately R18 to R20, runs $2,500 to $4,500, depending on your location and contractor availability. Some men rent foam equipment and do it themselves with 2-part closed-cell kits, which brings the material cost down but requires careful execution because adhesion and thickness uniformity matter. Below the foam, some builders add a second layer of rigid foam board on furring strips before installing the interior finish, pushing total R value to 30 or above. In interior Alaska, where temperatures can sit below -40 for weeks at a time, that extra thermal mass pays for itself in heating fuel within the first 2 winters. The floor requires its own approach. Rigid foam board under a subfloor, with a vapor barrier between the foam and the ground, prevents cold from migrating up through the skids. A cold floor is not just uncomfortable. In extreme cold, an uninsulated floor will drive your heating costs up dramatically because you're constantly losing heat to the frozen ground. Get the insulation right, and the Quonset performs. Get it wrong, and you'll spend every winter fighting a building that should have been your refuge. The question that every man watching this eventually asks is what it's actually like to live in one of these things through an Alaskan winter. The answer depends entirely on how well it was built. A properly insulated, properly heated Quonset cabin in Alaska is genuinely comfortable in conditions that would render most improvised shelters uninhabitable. The arched ceiling creates a surprising amount of perceived space for the square footage because there are no corners robbing you of usable volume. The wood stove, once it's up to temperature, holds heat well in the insulated interior. The LED lighting on a modest solar system keeps the space from feeling like a cave during the 20-hour nights of January. What changes is your relationship with logistics. Water is a planning exercise, not a tap you turn. You're either melting snow, hauling from a water source, or managing a wellhead heater to keep pipes from freezing. Propane for cooking runs out and needs to be tracked carefully. Firewood isn't something you order. It's something you cut, split, and stack in sufficient quantity before the first hard freeze, because there is no delivery service when the trail is under 4 feet of snow. The communication question is one that every man planning a remote Alaskan build needs to address before he's sitting in that cabin with a dead radio. Starlink's satellite internet has changed its calculations significantly in recent years, providing workable broadband speeds to locations that were genuinely dark only 5 years ago. A satellite communicator for emergency messaging is non-negotiable regardless of your internet setup. These are the tools that separate managed solitude from genuine danger. What men who have done this report almost universally is a shift in how they experience time. The constant background noise of modern life, the notifications, the obligations, the ambient anxiety of being continuously connected, it quiets. In its place comes a different kind of attention. You notice whether the way your grandfather did because it directly determines what you can and can't do tomorrow. You notice your own energy levels because physical work is the price of warmth and food. You notice what you actually need versus what modern life convinced you that you couldn't live without. That shift is not for every man. But for the men it's for, it tend to be permanent. Remote land in Alaska is available at prices that most Americans assume no longer exist anywhere in this country. Parcels in unorganized borough areas, land with no road access, no utilities, no infrastructure of any kind, can be purchased for $500 to $2,000 per acre. 5 acres of genuine Alaskan wilderness, yours outright, can cost less than a single month's rent in a mid-sized American city. The state of Alaska also still operates the Mental Health Trust Land Program and periodic land disposal programs that make parcels available at below-market prices to qualified buyers. These programs require research and patience, but men who have navigated them successfully have secured land at prices that would seem impossible anywhere else. The realistic pathway for a man starting from scratch looks like this. Buy remote land. Build a Quonset cabin as a base camp. Use it to hunt, trap, and learn the land through a full seasonal cycle. Make decisions about permanent infrastructure based on what you learn from actually living there rather than projecting from a map. This is how the men who actually stay in Alaska do it. Not by flying in with a dream and a credit card, but by building small, learning fast, and expanding deliberately. The building industry in the continental United States depends on you believing that shelter is complicated, that it requires licensed experts at every phase, that the materials are beyond the skill of a man working with his hands, that the process takes years and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that doing it any other way is reckless. Alaska proves that belief is not universally true. Men have been building functional, durable, safe shelters in Alaska's most extreme conditions without contractors, without permits, and without 6-figure budgets for as long as men have lived there. The Quonset kit is simply the most efficient modern tool for doing what those men have always done. The arch shape is not a compromise. It is genuinely superior to a conventional pitched roof in a high snow load environment. The steel is not a cheap substitute for wood. In an environment where moisture, pests, and freeze-thaw cycling destroy conventional building materials over time, steel outperforms wood in longevity. The kit assembly process is not a shortcut taken by men who don't know how to build. It is a rational response to the reality of building alone, far from supply chains, in a climate that punishes delay. What the Quonset cabin in Alaska actually represents is a man taking the question of shelter seriously enough to find the answer that works rather than the answer that's most familiar. That is a different kind of building. It requires a different kind of thinking, and it produces a different kind of life. Minus 38 degrees outside. For feet of snow on an arch roof that was designed in 1941 to be assembled by soldiers in the middle of a war. And inside it's warm. That's the whole story.